My name is Sarah Smith. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a professor of history at American River College, and today's date is May 15th, 2023. Okay, so let's start off by establishing some of the basics. What's your full name? What are your pronouns? And what's your date of birth?
My name is Alexander Ratcliffe. My pronouns are he, they, and my date of birth is September 29th, 2000.
How old are you?
I am 22 years old.
So tell me a little about yourself. What are your interests and hobbies? What do you like to do?
I'm into. I'm probably going to be like a professional student at this point. I'm going for my PhD just because I like learning so much. And so when I'm not in classes, I spend a lot of time actually just studying or doing research on very vague topics. The most recent one was the Defense of Marriage Act of 1998, because it was the act that kept the U.S. from joining the surge of gay marriage back in the mid-2000s, and it wasn't repealed until 2013, and I could go on several rants about that, actually. But yeah, basically I just do a lot of deep dives into very specific topics and research. And then when I'm not doing that, I play video games.
Are there any video games in particular that you like?
Currently, well, there's the video game series that I'm currently repping, which is the Kingdom Hearts series. It's an RPG that Square Enix, a big video game company, did with Disney, and it's been a long-running series. It's started in the early 2000s, and it's still going now. There's probably like 16 or 17 games. And it's about the idea of strength and family, and also bringing your own values and compassion to what seems to be a very complex situation and using them as your guide to figure it out. And it's a rather complex series, but then it's also got Goofy and Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, and they're there the entire time, so it really is kind of a lightly toned series.
So, any other interests or hobbies or anything you like to do in your free time that you want to mention?
I write stories, with a caveat that I haven't actually written anything in a while, but I have a book that I have finished the first draft of, and I'm currently editing, and I've got the second book planned out, and then eventually I might try to publish it, who knows. But that's always been a minor hobby of mine, is just writing stories.
What are your stories about?
It depends. Like, a lot of them start based on just a random dream I have, and then my brain takes that idea and just runs with it for about 3 weeks, and that's when I plan it. So this most recent one was about, it's a rather thinly veiled criticism of Christianity, but it's set in a fantasy world where the main character wakes up and has been designated to be the fifth horseman of the apocalypse. And so a lot of his journey is figuring out why he was designated that, what the situation is regarding the other horsemen, why they are such big motivators in, like, keeping the citizens in line, because anytime the kingdom does something that heaven does not agree with, heaven invokes another apocalypse. And so this most recent decision was a really big one that heaven did not agree with, so they added another horseman, but in doing so, they took away the mystery behind the fact that they're using the apocalypse to control the people.
That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. It's it was a rather complicated book when I started writing it because I had to be careful on certain aspects of it and make sure I wasn't pulling in the wrong direction too much.
Can you talk a little bit about where you grew up and where do you live now?
I grew up in North Highlands, which is North Sacramento. It was, and still is to my knowledge, a rather low-income area. The school I went to was a K-8, and it was right across the high school. And that high school had probably 3 shootings in the time I was at that K-8. And both of the houses on either side of our house that we rented was, they were both foreclosed at some point. One of them finally got bought and cleaned up and became a house for someone who wanted to train attack dogs. But it was not the best area. And so there was a lot of, like, you couldn't go outside, you couldn't play anywhere, you had to stay in the house when you weren't at school, or you had to stay on campus and make sure you weren't, like, by the street. And then where I live now, I'm staying with my parents temporarily, and they're up in Folsom now, and it is a completely different culture. Like, everybody has their lawns taken care of, and if your lawn is longer than 1/4 of an inch off the ground, then you get a notice from the homeowners association. And there's a bunch of, like, social engagement and rules that you really have to pay attention to and be aware of. And the kids will just play in the street, and if you're not careful, they'll run out in front of your car because they just feel safe enough to just run wherever. And while it's kind of nice, I don't like almost running over children. You know. And it's just really weird to live in the house and not have to worry about if all the doors are locked, if the fence is gonna, like, get knocked down from the dogs getting wild next door again. Because in between my parents moving, I moved out and was living in an apartment in the similar area for a long time. So I didn't have that transitional period that they did, where they were, like, slowly moving through the middle class. I was there in the lower income areas, and then suddenly I was in the higher income areas. So it's been a kind of a shock.
How long have you lived with your parents for? Recently, I guess.
Like 8 months, about. I'm planning on moving out in the fall once I get through the internship and build up enough savings to be able to live near Sac State without having to worry too much about rent. And originally I was looking at Sac State housing, but no, that's way too expensive. So in total, I'll probably be there a little over a year, but I moved there what month is it? Close to August, I think, last year. And previously I was, I'd been kicked out of my apartment with my roommates, and I didn't have another place to stay, which is mostly why my parents took me back.
So I think this might be a topic we return to, but if you don't mind me transitioning, can you tell me a little bit about how you identify with regard to your social identities, broadly speaking. So gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, disability, and so on.
Yeah. So in regards to gender and sexuality, I have gone through so many labels that at this point I really just use the word queer unless I'm really going into what it means to me to be trans and gay and all that. But the most common label I've used is gender fluid, and I don't really have a label for my sexuality. And then I identify pretty strongly with being disabled, like both physically and mentally, because I have a lot of experiences there where I have needed to form an identity surrounding that to access resources to help me get through it. I don't know. I don't have. So, yeah. Queer, and then disabled, and then in terms of class identification, I identify most with the lower working class because that's where I've been most of my life.
Anything else you want to say about your social identities right now?
I don't think so.
So you said that you identify as gender fluid. Can you talk a little bit about what that means to you? What does it mean to be gender fluid?
So because of my disabilities, specifically my mental ones, it's very hard for me to identify a sense of gender outside of expectations that people place. And I don't really subscribe to the idea of a particular gender being the one and only thing that you can be as a human. So I use the term gender fluid to refer to the fact that sometimes I have more feminine qualities, or I take on a more feminine role, or I express myself in a way that is considered feminine to other people. And sometimes I take on more masculine qualities or a masculine role, or I take on more masculine positions. And so a lot of how I present myself to the general public is masculine, he, him pronouns, just anything that gains me enough acknowledgement to where I know that that person will see me not as a gender, but as something to, or someone to address, which sounds, I realize that it sounds kind of iffy, but growing up and being referred to exclusively as female and she, her, most of that time, when they specifically referenced my gender or my pronouns, I was being dismissed. And so I use the adaptation of masculinity because I can, because it gains me more, at least it gains me more, a bigger sense of safety and confidence. And if I can have those, I tend to gain more respect. It's not a direct relationship, but it felt like reclaiming my own body. But I still, I am not a man. I am not a woman. I am just a person, and I express myself sometimes in ways that makes people very confused. And in that, I use the term queer or gender fluid because it usually helps people move on from being confused and focus on what I'm trying to say instead.
So you said your disabilities influence your view of gender. Can you talk a little bit more about your disabilities and what do you mean by that?
So I am autistic, and I grew up developmentally disabled, but not intellectually disabled, which meant that a lot of what I struggled with flew under the radar, especially for the fact that my school was a low-income school with very little resources. So I was able to understand a lot of the classwork that we had going on, but I struggled and still do sometimes with a lot of the language and a lot of the social aspects, which is kind of why I went into psychology, because I wanted to study them to understand them. Especially when I was younger, I just didn't understand and didn't like that there was supposedly this difference between the power of what people could do and what people couldn't based on a factor that was outside of their control. And I didn't understand the difference between a man and a woman just kind of at all, because I just didn't see why there had to be a difference, I guess. And approaching that from that perspective has kind of informed my my own expression and my own will to be something outside of a system that is constantly just pressuring you to be one way or another. Because one of the most specific things about autism that you will run into is we tend to have a very set and complex view of what is morally right and wrong. And unless you can justify or explain why something is right and wrong that doesn't fit into that, it will bother us, and we cannot let it go or suppress it. At least that's been my experience. So, my other disabilities, to a lesser extent, have played a part in it, but my autism has really informed my identity in almost every way and how I interact with the world.
So you've talked about this some already, but how would you say, or maybe the way I should ask this question is there anything else you want to say about what gender feels like to you, considering what you've already said?
So from what I've already said, you might think that gender doesn't really feel like anything to me, and that's not necessarily true. It's more that gender is something that if I perform it right, then I get rewarded with certain things, such as social acceptance or more opportunities, or even just, hey, this is really fun from this particular perspective. And it's almost automatic that in certain situations, to me, I feel more one way than the other. So when I'm socializing or having fun with my friends, or I'm in a particular mood due to a number of different factors, I will feel more one way on a gender than the other. But that it isn't, it's like, it's not, I don't decide which way it goes, but it's also not an innate feeling for me. Is I think that's the best way to put it.
So, would you mind talking some about your coming out experience? What was the process like of figuring your identity out? And are you up to your family? How have they responded to you coming out? There's a lot of questions there, I realize.
Um, coming out for me, coming out for me has been an ongoing process. Like, for my family specifically, I knew pretty close to immediately when I heard about the concept of being trans and the concept of being outside of gender that that's what I was. But having my family be culturally Christian and white and with the mindset that they must continue to make more money and be a part of society in the way that society expects, they were accepting when I eventually told them, but they were more afraid of the deviance than they were of what could happen if we ignored it. And they're a lot better about it now, but a large part of my coming out journey has been realizing that a lot of times if someone is not queer themselves, you kind of have to dumb it down and make it simple and easy for them to understand so they don't become afraid of the unknown. And so to my parents, I am a trans man. That is all I am. And they figuring out the gender thing kind of eclipsed any sort of sexuality thing because, to be honest, my parents thought I was a lesbian far before I understood being what queer was. So they were accepting eventually, but the coming out process, especially to people who weren't queer, who weren't, my peers and my friends, was something that taught me the danger of being queer. And it was something that caused a lot of conflict in my family and a lot of no, that's about it. A lot of conflict.
Is there anything you want to elaborate on with regard to what you just said about conflict?
So, without going too much into the patriarchal gender norms that are in the average American white middle class family, my father especially has had a long journey coming from where he started to where he is now and accepting that there is no more power to be had in being the head man of the family. You can't dictate someone else's experiences or someone else's actions or identities just because you are making the most money in this situation, or you are the oldest, or you are a man. And he had a hard time accepting that I didn't make it very easy on him because I, especially when I was younger, was very argumentative because I needed to argue to figure things out. But he doesn't accept disagreement or conflict very well because he sees it as undermining him. And my mom, on the other hand, is terrified of any sort of deviance and is terrified of any sort of conflict. And so she had a really hard time adjusting to the change, even if she wasn't opposed to it. And part of that adjustment was the fact that at points she had to stand up to my dad about my identity. And that is something she still fails to do most of the time. So a lot of times it was me on my own against the people who were supposed to be the ones backing me up.
So, how did that make you feel, or how does it make you feel? Having just said that.
It's mostly, it's just unfair. When I was younger, it bothered me to the point of being really depressed and really upset about any sort of interaction I had to have with my family. And I have since studied a lot more psychology and a lot more of people, because part of why it bothered me is because I just didn't understand. And I do understand now. I understand most of the factors as to where it's coming from. And so I can reconcile my own emotions with the reality of the situation rather than having them feel like I'm overreacting or I just don't have any sort of place for myself. So when I was younger, it really, really affected me in a lot of ways. And now it's just kind of an echo of that pain, but it's just a memory. It's not something that bothers me anymore, partially because my dad's doing better and partially because I've done my own work around it. So it's unfair, but I can see where it is and what it is that's unfair. And so I can work on it, which makes me feel almost optimistic.
So, where did you and where do you find support and affirmation in your identities?
I've managed to get a lot better about providing it for myself. For one thing, I started going to therapy once I could afford it because therapy's pretty great. And I've been better about being proactive about just connecting with people around me that I know would be good to connect with and affirm with. Like, I used to be a really big introvert, and I've been working a lot on that for the past year, and I've just made friends with several people. Like, I have managed to put myself out there in ways that I never would have been able to before, either because I just didn't know how to parse my words in a way that they would understand, or because I was way too anxious about it because people are scary. But I've formed my own community because I have formed my own sense of self and confidence in whatever I do. And so I will work one job and I'll take one or two friends from there, and then I'll work another job and take one or two friends from there. And a lot of times it's easy to pinpoint whoever else is queer in the class that I'm taking and just talk to them until they like me. So drawing from what I can get from my surroundings and then forming my own, making sure I am meeting my own needs as much as I can, has really helped me gain my own sense of, like, self-efficacy, I think is the right word there. because if I can rely on myself, then I know I can rely on other people. I'm not sure that was quite addressing the question you asked. Now that I think about it, I don't remember what the question was.
I think it was, where do you find affirmation and support? I think you addressed the question.
Okay.
But I guess a follow-up question would be, how do you find community? How do you find friends? You said you've been doing a lot of work in the last year, but how have you found people? I think you mentioned work. Do you find people at school? Like, what does that mean? And who do you look to, I guess, to be your friend? You said queer people sometimes.
A lot of times, like, so studying people as an autistic person, you get an outside view. And once you start studying them enough, you know enough of the science that you're like, okay, I've talked to this person 2 or 3 times. The way they approach things with their logic means they will be cool. And sometimes I'm wrong, but most of the time I'm not. And then a lot of times it's whoever is visibly disregarding gender norms in some way, shape, or form. Like my current boyfriend, I was going to say I acquired him at Home Goods. He was my coworker at Home Goods. And all it took was the fact that he had long hair and wore a scrunchie instead of just a regular hairband. And I was like, okay, I got you. I know you. I don't know. I'm really good at placing people into boxes where I know where that's going, in a sense. Like, I've found myself with the uncanny ability to tell when other people are neurodivergent or autistic. It's not 100%. Like, I'd have to get to know them. But once I get to know them, I can usually tell, hey, we've gotten to know each other, and their logic is not the motivations and the logic that the average population use. They either use way too much logic, or they have a very specific logical system. And I can see where that's coinciding. It's really hard to describe, but I think 4 out of 5 of my childhood best friends also ended up being trans and autistic years after I knew them. And then my most recent roommates, 2 out of the 3 of them ended up being autistic. And then don't tell my boyfriend this, but I've got my suspicions.
Well, this isn't being video recorded, so don't worry.
Yeah. So, long story short, I don't know how to describe it, but I'm just rather good at telling who's going to be in that sort of position where I can joke around with them, or I can form communities with them, or go do things with them, and who's going to be in that box where I can say, hey, did you know that crabs appeared 4 times in the length of evolution? It wasn't 4 times. But instead of being like, that was completely random, why'd you say that? They'll be like, whoa, that's so cool. Really? And so, like, it's a specific, like, trait, I guess. But, yeah, no, I need to figure that out. I gotta translate that into something that makes sense.
I think that makes sense.
Okay.
So, a question I probably should have asked earlier, but are you a community college student?
Yes. I am currently, or I am graduating from Folsom Lake on Thursday. So I have been going to American River and then Folsom Lake for the past 5 years now. Um, I had to take a break in the middle because of COVID, and then there was a period in time where I could only take partial classes because of various factors. But I am graduating with an associate's in psychology and an associate's in social sciences.
Well, congratulations on graduating. What are your plans now?
I am set up to transfer to Sac State. I'm doing the honors program, and I'm hoping to get into some undergraduate research stuff because eventually I'm going to go get my PhD. But that's going to take a while.
So you said COVID intervened a little bit, intervened in your progress. What happened with COVID?
So I moved out of my parents' place like 3 or 4 months after I turned 18. So at the... No, actually. Yeah. I moved out. I lived, I basically couch hopped a little bit. And then I lived in an apartment with 2 or 3 roommates. And then right as I moved in there, and it was a higher rent than I was used to at all, COVID hit and I lost my job, and I lost at that same time, kind of unrelatedly, the ability to drive, which really limited my options on getting another job. So, I have not a compromised immune system, but a stress-regulated immune system due to some kind of weird something going on with my various disabilities. And so if I get too stressed, I will get sick. And in that environment, I get sick more easily if I'm exposed to sickness. So I wasn't supposed to be working. And so I was out of a job for a while. And because of that, I couldn't pay for college because I was using all the stimulus checks to pay for rent. And then when I was back in the job, I was working something 30 hours a week plus. And I was trying to go back to school. And I am just so bad at online classes. Like, one of my mental disabilities is ADHD. And so a lot of times I would just straight up forget that I had online classes to do for a week and a half, and then I'd log back in and, hey, you have 4 missing assignments. Yeah. Oh, yikes. And so between forgetting to do the classes and then getting sick every month because I was working more than I was supposed to in an environment that was not safe for me, I ended up having to take a semester off. Then I went back and I dropped a semester. Then I went back again and I had like 1 or 2 classes. And then after 1.5 to 2 years, I was able to start finally getting back into classes again. So it was an ordeal.
So, I'm trying to think what the follow-up question should be. So you said that you struggled in various classes, like you were taking classes and you dropped out. You ended up dropping the classes that semester.
Mm-hmm.
And you explained why you struggled. Right there, you had some economic pressure. You have just things like, your ADHD and other disabilities were sort of influenced how you were doing in the class.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else you want to say about what made you struggle in those classes?
So I, just in school in general, and this was a factor then, but it's kind of always a factor for me. I have to have things be clear to understand what I'm supposed to be doing. Like, I've been doing an intro to public speaking class this past semester, and that has been really frustrating for me because the 3 or 4 different guidelines for the assignments that are put out, they'll all be different. They'll all be different. One will say, hey, this speech is 2 to 3 minutes long. The other will say, hey, this speech is 4 to 5 minutes long. And it's not until the week before that you find out which one is which and what the guidelines and which rubric to be using. And it's something that I imagine most students would struggle with. But I personally, with my specific neuroses, have a really hard time starting on an assignment until I know exactly what I'm going to do. So, being clear, and then I tend to have a lot of follow-up questions if I'm unclear, and a lot of times professors will be very vague in their responses, and they'll want me to come to office hours most of the time through which I am working. And while I would love to come to office hours, I cannot. I did have one professor that I was able to come to office hours for because I was nearby. But there were a number of different class assignments or methods of teaching that weren't conducive to my own learning. And so another thing is having my grade being based off of other students' work. Like, if in group projects, we had one in my neuroanatomy class where we were having to do a group assignment on something or other, and we had to each write up a part, and my part was based on other people's parts, and if I can't understand where they're going or why they're using that particular word, then I can't write up my own part, unless I just completely do the rest of that myself in my head, and then based on what I've decided they meant, write my own part. So, yeah, no, a lot of the just social aspects of college were very, they were quite a barrier at times.
Okay, I'm going to back up a step here and ask you some questions about class and then continue the conversation about education. But you mentioned that you grew up low income, but that your family became middle class. So did your family struggle economically when you were growing up?
Yes, quite a bit. We were living month to month on rent. My parents were supporting each other as they went through school, so they were taking turns. So for the first few years of my life, my dad wasn't around much at all because he was doing school full-time and doing work part-time. And then my mom was spending most of that time taking care of me when she wasn't working. And then the situation kind of flipped after my dad got his degree and got a job in financing. But he only had like a junior accountant or whatever level. Like, it wasn't a very well-paying job. It wasn't enough to keep up with the fact that our rent kept getting raised, and by then both of my siblings had appeared. My brother was still an infant, and at one point we got a cat, which probably, looking back, wasn't the best idea because it was, we were having problems putting food on the table. Because my parents had a really bad opinion about anyone who went on social services. But they spent a lot of time working, and I spent a lot of time taking care of my siblings and doing my homework and going to school. And so it was a distinctly, okay, we're having boxed mac and cheese this month because we got a sale on something or other and a coupon, and now we have this giant 48 pack of boxed mac and cheese, and now that's my favorite food. Which is better than not being able to ever eat it again. But it was you had to be very conscious of what you were doing and what you were experiencing and who the people around you were, because there was a lot of, you have to be afraid of strangers, you have to be afraid of what you tell strangers, because you might get your parents in trouble if they find out that they can't put food on the table this week.
It sounds super stressful.
It was, especially for younger me, when I didn't understand why things weren't fair. It was quite stressful. It was the hold on, I gotta gather my thoughts a little. It was really stressful, but it was also the only life I had ever known. It wasn't like I was looking at my friend's house and going over there and they had like a ton of games and a ton of food and whichever. Like, the most I was exposed to as a kid was one of my friends had Cocoa Puffs every morning, and I was like, wow, really, every morning? And so every once in a while I'd go over to his house and have Cocoa Puffs before school, and that was like a major treat. And so most of my friends were in similar situations, so there wasn't like much difference in how I saw things versus how I expected them to be. It's just that how I saw things versus how I saw things on the TV, that I was like, this isn't fair. We shouldn't have to live like this. But it's not as if it was something that actively, like, it wasn't like a social divide within my immediate life, I think.
Did you share a room with either of your siblings or both of your siblings?
Yeah. I didn't get my own room until I turned 13. It was... First, I shared with... Because we rented like a 3-bedroom house, and first I shared with my little sister, and then I shared with my little brother because they needed someone to be there to make sure that if he cried at night or needed something, that someone was there to take care of him. And then once he grew old enough that he wasn't like a toddler anymore, they give him his own room because, you know, boys and girls need to be separated. And then I shared with my sister again.
So what are your siblings' ages?
My sister is 4 years younger than me, and my brother is like 8.5 years younger than me. So I was probably about 9 by the time he came around and was like actively something I took part in helping take care of him. With my sister, I tried, but it was mostly me running and grabbing something for my parents or for the babysitter. It wasn't like I was actively babysitting her at 5 years old.
So did financial stressors make it difficult to concentrate on your work at school?
Not at first, because I am the type of autistic that could really get schoolwork. I actually kind of got a bit of special treatment at my school because my teachers kind of knew something was off, but they also didn't have the resources to do any testing, and even if they did, my parents wouldn't have consented to it. So they helped make sure that where they could, they provided, because I was allowed into the after school program without, and they provided food there. And then I did really well in my classes up until about 5th or 6th grade because I really got the subject matter. And then 5th or 6th grade, I started to have a lot of mental and physical health issues. And we still didn't have the money to go to the doctor. And then that's kind of when things started not doing well in school.
What physical and what health issues did you have at that time?
So part of the drawbacks for me, at least for autism, is if I get too stressed, I can't do anything. I need to sit and I need to process and I need to be able to sort things out. And once I hit 6th grade and my parents were trying to make me go into sports, and I was dealing with taking care of siblings who were not logical at all because they're 3 and like 4. And I was trying to keep track of my homework, but by that point, my ADHD had just kicked in full force, and I would forget that homework existed as soon as I got home. And so it would just remain in the black hole that was my backpack. And so I had a lot of stress surrounding that, and I started having meltdowns, and I started not being able to do pretty much anything that I used to be able to do. And I got really burnt out in 6th grade. And my parents didn't quite understand that because they weren't, for one, they're not autistic, and for another, they weren't really around to see how much I was doing or how much it took a toll on me to do what I was doing. And so I just spent most of that year like sleeping. That's kind of my go-to whenever I get too stressed now, is my nervous system will just shut down and I'll take a nap wherever I am. And so if you remain in that state where your nervous system is far too activated for a long time, it starts to degrade. And so now I have a lot of like physical disorders that are connected to that. Like I have Ehlers-Danlos with hypermobility, so I can dislocate my joints and all that. And my chronic pain is pretty closely connected. Chronic pain and inflammation is pretty closely connected to how stressed I am. And I have IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome, which is unpleasant to have and to talk about. And so my ability to digest certain foods at all is also connected to how stressed I am. And I developed lactose intolerance just as a general rule because I'm not allowed to eat certain foods anymore. And when you have limited options for food, you're still going to eat the food you have. And so having all of those things pile on and then add to the fact that I didn't have a vocabulary for the fact that my hands and my arms and my legs hurt all the time and they weren't supposed to, and that sometimes my guts just decided not to work at all. And so having all of that pile on all at once, it just kind of caused me to collapse. And following 6th grade onward through 12th grade, I did pretty bad in school.
So you said that you struggled in school from about what age again? About 6th grade onward?
Yeah.
When were you diagnosed as autistic?
So funny thing about that, I didn't know about being autistic at all until 2020. Like early 2020, I had moved in with my roommate and he was diagnosed and he was like, dude, you gotta do something. You're on there. And so I started pursuing a diagnosis through Kaiser. And throughout the diagnostic process, the diagnostician kept saying, yeah, I think they would have seen it sooner, and you're just presenting too many signs. And I was like, that's what my roommate said, but it sounds like you're saying that you think I'm faking, and lo and behold, after, 8 months and several $100s, she decided that I was not autistic. Instead, I was faking and had BPD, and refused to tell me that she...
bipolar disorder?
No,
what's BPD?
A borderline personality disorder. It's an actual disorder. However, it is the most common misdiagnosis for autism, and it's often referred to as a punishment disorder because it was basically what replaced hysteria when they transferred to the DSM-4. So, especially in Kaiser and other medicalized settings for, or capitalized settings for mental health treatment, once you have a diagnosis like a personality disorder, they will refuse to provide you with more services unless you specifically continually advocate for them. And they will constantly doubt you just on the basis of, hey, someone once said you were hysterical, or you were faking something. And I didn't find out about that misdiagnosis because it was hidden from my chart until earlier this year. So I have had over 2 years of basically medical maltreatment because one psychiatrist was like, hey, you're too autistic, therefore you're not autistic. And I have talked it over with my therapist, and we've done all of the assessments that the psychiatrist did not do. And she was like, yeah, it's quite obviously autism. It's not, you don't have any sort of personality disorder. This is kind of actually quite wild to me that she would say that. And I was like, yeah, right? It's really funny how that works. So I still to this day don't have an official diagnosis of autism, even though I've had 2 or 3 different medical professionals say, hey, you've definitely got the traits.
So growing up, you didn't get any support for being autistic because you never got a diagnosis.
Mm-mm.
Do you think that's wrapped up in being low income? The fact that you didn't get a diagnosis earlier?
I mean, that's a very large part of it. Another large part of it is, especially in the early 2000s, the only presentation we had ever seen for autism was young white boys who were very into trains. And the only people talking about autism were the people behind Autism Speaks, which is a company that focuses mainly on the idea of curing autism. And so there's a large surge, especially in the past 5 or so years, of people who were assigned female at birth or just presented atypically, or especially people of color who are either getting diagnoses or looking at the criteria and saying, hey, I meet that to a clinical level. I am definitely autistic. But there's still a lot of bias within the psychiatric community against the idea of autism and the idea that someone can be autistic and have it be missed, which is a large part of the reason why the psychiatrist that I saw refused to diagnose me. So I, being low income, not having access to any medical services, or not having a school that had access, had a large part of it. The societal view of autism had a large part of it. And then my parents' own view of any sort of disability or medical issue had a part of it, because they, even if I was offered the ability to be assessed, they would not have taken it. They see that sort of label as a crutch, is the phrase that I've seen used most commonly.
So what's the, how do you feel now? You've sort of figured out that you're autistic, you're figured out your identity in terms of your gender. I know it's evolving, but do you feel empowered now more than you ever have felt before, knowing both of these things about yourself?
Definitely. Not knowing much of anything that was going on when I was younger, especially in regards to myself and why I was so different, because when you see a lot of patterns in other people, you also see a lot of patterns that are either there or definitely not there in yourself. And so I knew I was different. I had no clue why. And I, at the time, didn't even realize I was being socially isolated for it, because I didn't know about it or how to work around it. And now that I've got the words and the vocabulary for it, and now that I've got the understanding for what it means for me and the control over what it means for other people in regards to me, that's something that's been extremely empowering. I struggled a lot with the typical anxiety and depression when I was in high school, because at the time I felt like I had no power over what I was doing in any aspect of my life, and I felt like my identity was always going to be something that was either ignored or used against me. And now that I've finally formed my own areas in my own community and my own ability to self-affirm, I have all of that power, and I can build myself up, and I can grow, and I can change however I want to, because I have the vocabulary and I have the resources to move around or to utilize my disability and my gender.
So you said that you experienced homelessness at some point in your life, right? What was that experience, or why did you experience homelessness?
So it was very short-lived, and it wasn't the typical you live on the streets. It was more I was couch hopping and I was sleeping in the back of my car, and I was trying to find a place because I had people to find a place with. And then it was only for like a few weeks, and then we found a place. But it was mostly because I had gotten to the point where I couldn't stand having no control over myself and my actions, and I had to leave my home environment. And I probably could have returned and lived there until I found a place with my fellow friends, roommates, whatever. But I wouldn't have been able to cope very well with that. And I took my chances just relying in other ways on my friends, and it worked out. And then when I was kicked out of the apartment, it happened again for a few days, and my parents were like, hey, come live with us. And I was like, well, I don't have any other plans, so I guess I will. And then that turned out a lot better than it did the first time. Thankfully.
And what was that experience like for you, being homeless?
It was terrifying and also very boring. Like, not knowing where I was, if I was going to like get arrested or get in trouble, or my friend's landlord was going to come home and get them in trouble. All of that was very scary. But when you don't have anything to do, because at that time I was working maybe 2 days a week, and you don't have the internet or anything like that, you just kind of sit there and you think about things, and that's all you do. So like, because at that time I couldn't really afford to be using any like phone data, so I couldn't look things up or anything on my phone. I had like 3 books that I had read a lot. And my friends that I was crashing on couches with were all working most of the time. So they weren't home to like socialize or do anything like that. And it was a really weird experience. And I just remember looking back a lot at the philosophy class I took in, I think, my first semester in college. And like, just thinking about that and developing those theories in my mind because I had nothing better to do. Besides, like, rework the budget 10 more times. So, it was, yeah, terrifying, but also very boring.
So you've made reference to various jobs that you've worked at.
Mm-hmm.
You said you work at Home Goods, or you currently work at some Home Goods.
I have worked... Home Goods was my 5th job since 2018. So I've worked about a year a job. Not exactly, but about. And And Home Goods was probably the best out of all of them. It was still very, very, like, there's a statistic that 85% of autistic adults are either chronically hopping jobs or chronically unemployed. And a large part of that, I think, is the inability to accept when things are wrong and move on and work with that. Because most minimum wage jobs these days, and I would say most jobs, but I haven't worked a non-minimum wage job yet, most of those jobs involve the employers being really, really shitty to either the employees or a specific group of the customers or just people in general. Like, my first job, I was a busser at a restaurant, and I could not touch wet food because I have sensory issues, and every time I did, I would end up going home crying that day because I had pushed myself far too much, and because they didn't understand what was wrong with me, and I didn't understand what was wrong with me. I didn't end up getting very many hours, and they also, like, broke a bunch of health cuts, which I really didn't like. But, like, I ended up leaving both because of the stress and because at one point they flooded due to broken pipes, and they tried to keep us continuing working in that conditions, even though the dishwasher was broken. And they were trying to use dirty plates to serve to customers, and I was like, nope, nope. Mm-mm. And so it's just been like situations like that. Like, people will stay because they just don't care to leave and go through the effort of finding another job. But I cannot stay in an environment that is actively, like, wrong. Like at CVS, the manager there switched, and she decided that she wanted to hire more employees, so she tried to get the employer, the person who usually trained the new employees, to take on more than her job description without any, like, not upgrade, promotion or pay increase or anything. And the lady was already working 50-hour weeks, and she was like, hey, no, I need something out of this. And so the employer threatened to dock her pay, which is A, illegal, and B, she was already on minimum wage. So the employee was going to quit, and to keep her, some kind of logic caused the employer to fire some of the other workers because, oh no, we need you. We really appreciate the work you do around here. And the employee was like, did you expect that to work? Like, that makes me want to leave more because you're just using them as pawns. And I was just kind of sitting there like, yeah, you go. Just go. Just go. And then by the time that whole fiasco was done, we had a total of 3 employees in the entire store. And we were a 24-hour CVS. So I was working 60-hour weeks, and I was in chronic pain all the time. And it was a job that I had to take the bus for over an hour each way for. And my shift always ended after the buses stopped, so I had to take an Uber home, which was really expensive, even though I told them that my availability wasn't there. And anyway, it was just a shitty job, and I've had a line of shitty jobs that other people might have stuck it out for, but I just couldn't. And then Home Goods, I only left because I got the internship.
So were you out as queer and friends at these jobs?
Some of them. Like, I was very visibly not, like, straight. With the busser job, the people running it were so old that I'm not sure they could tell the difference. Like, I walked in with short hair, skinny little white dude, and the owner took one look at me and was like, yeah, you're hired. And I was like, okay, cool. And I came back the next day, and all the other bussers, skinny little white dudes. And I worked there for over a year, and at one point, towards the end of it, I called out sick, and the owner was like, who? Even though I saw him like 4 or 5 days a week back when I was working 4 or 5 days a week. So yeah, there was a level of anonymity there. And at that point, I liked to pretend that they couldn't tell I was like queer or trans. I'm pretty sure it wasn't like that, but nobody knew enough to ask me, and I didn't care enough to explicitly tell anybody. But on the flip side of that, the job after that was at Ross, and Ross was a good job until management changed, which is a running theme. And the new manager felt like she was doing everybody a favor and broke the non-discrimination laws by exposing people and making sure she informed everyone that me and my 2 trans coworkers, that our legal names were not the names on the roster, but she wasn't allowed to put the correct names on the roster, so she just told them what our names were. And she made sure to actively misgender us in front of other customers and all of this. And I was like, okay, well, I really don't care for you. And 2 of my other coworkers left, and then I had a month before I was going to move anyway, so I was like, okay, I'll stick it out for a month, but I've reported you, and Ross did nothing, and my coworkers reported you, and Ross also did nothing. So I was definitely out as trans there. In the job since, at least with CVS, it didn't really matter that much. And by the time I got to Baskin-Robbins, I had legally changed my name, and if I put a little effort in, I could pass as male. And they didn't really, like, especially for a job that mostly employed teenagers, everybody was like, okay, they didn't give me a second glance. And then at that point, I decided that I was going to not stick to gender norms anymore, because that was just exhausting. And then I ended up getting the Home Goods job, and the Home Goods job is full of upper middle class white people who could not ask an awkward question to save their lives. So there was a lot of dancing around the, you have different pronouns, or you are long hair. So it's been awkward, and I've been out as trans there, but it was a different engagement than being out without, like, my consent in the matter. It was, oh wow, I'm just gonna laugh at you guys because you're literally all just dancing around a subject that would be cleared up in 2 seconds if you asked, and this is honestly really kind of hilarious. So
So you were able to look at it with some amusement. Did it ever make you feel like upset or uncomfortable?
Maybe when I first started, when I was like training, because I walked in on two of my coworkers who were discussing a coworker that was no longer working there. And the entire conversation, they both were referring to the same person, and one person just consistently used she, her pronouns, and the other person consistently used he, him pronouns. And they were both on the same page about who they were talking about. And I was not. And I was very confused and a little concerned because, like, really? That's what you do when you aren't sure? You're just...
You don't think they were just trying to respect the employee's gender fluidity?
You know, they might have been. They certainly might have been. In which case, good on them.
Seems unlikely, though.
Seems unlikely. So they, at points, the awkwardness got to me a little, but like I said, I met my boyfriend there, and I had a few friends there, and I was just kind of like chilling with them. And then if it ever became a problem with the other people, I would just bring it up to the assistant manager, and she'd be like, yeah, I'll talk to them. And then they'd just be the normal level of awkward going forward. Yeah. So it was actually kind of cool, that job, because there was one coworker that I knew, and I worked in the back a lot, so I was moving big boxes and furniture and all that. And he was the guy who unloaded the truck because he is the type of person who is physically incapable of not saying something offensive every 20 minutes. And he never really means it, is the thing. He, like, just says it because he's used to that culture and he thinks it's funny. And so he'll say something and we'll go, okay. And then he goes, okay. And he'll move on. And in the past month or so working there, apparently he was doing a lot of like research and a lot of talking to different people and actually looking into queer people and trans people, because I am a very confusing person to look at. And so he spent a lot of time when I first started using she, her pronouns for me, which a large part of my therapy has just been, hey, I don't want to be bothered by that, and it's probably going to continue to happen, so let's work on my own reaction to it. And so now it doesn't bother me anymore. But he saw that that was not how I was presenting to people, and he actively took the time to learn about it and try to change. And he's not good at it. He's so bad at it. But the fact that he like took me aside every time he messed up and apologized, which was every time, that meant so much more to me than the fact that he messed up in the first place. Like, he wouldn't even let me dismiss the topic. He would just say, no, it's not okay. I'm gonna work on this. I know it's an issue. And I'm like, it's not an issue for me, dude, but I love this personal growth for you. This is amazing. So that was a really good experience.
So can you talk some about your experience taking courses that are either wholly or in part focus on queer and trans topics?
So that's kind of a two-parter for me, because the classes that I took that were focused wholly on it, like the Intro to Queer Studies, those were amazing to me. Just having that much knowledge and that much in-depth history and perspectives on our community that weren't just, hey, in 2013 we focused on trying to exclude asexual people. In 2014 we focused on bi people. In 2015 through 2017, it was trans people, and now we're back there again. So having like the decades old history on it is something that really helped put things in perspective and helped me come to my own terms on my identity. And just they were the subject of many of those deep dives that I do. I would research so much on them just because it was so fascinating to me. And then the classes that focused in part on it or had it as a subject that they addressed but didn't have a speciality in, like my psychology classes, human development and abnormal psych, they weren't great. A lot of their information was outdated and they were trying to be correct with it, but I think the human development textbook was the same as the one for 2012, and it discussed gender establishment for about 5 seconds. And then it was like, and trans people exist and kind of just appear, and sometimes they change gender when they're older and sometimes they don't. And I was like, you are going to be so misunderstood by most of these students here. And they were. So I tried to do my best to adjust to that, but it wasn't great. And then the abnormal psych class focused mostly on the concept of gender dysphoria because that's in the DSM, and that was that class, is just going over the DSM. And there was so much misinformation about it that I ended up talking to the professor, and then the next class being like, okay guys, take a step back. I know you all had questions and you got so much wrong. So I had to explain the concept and separate it out from the idea of gender diversity and kind of teach that portion of the subject myself because it wasn't well done at all. So there are just times in classes where if it's not well researched, it is kind of actively harmful. But if it is well researched or it is the focus, and it's usually both if it's the focus, then it's amazing. It's something that keeps me engaged with the classes. It's something that helps me connect that to my own experiences rather than just saying, hey, kids develop a vocabulary of about 60 words at age 2 and 3,000 at age 3. Like, having that kind of connection to the human experience rather than the scientific experience was really beneficial.
Prior to taking these courses, like Intro to Queer Studies and at the community college level, had you ever experienced in school your teachers including queer and trans topics in a meaningful way?
Not in a meaningful way, no. There was a total of one time in my high school classes that mentioned gay and trans people, and it was my hippie history teacher who was talking about the war and talking about the counter movements, and he mentioned the LGBT movement that was happening around that time. Actually, I think that's the wrong timeline, but he actually talked about them as if they were just people instead of, oh, we can't discuss that, which was really cool. And also he was just a really cool guy. I did spend a lot of time educating my teachers and faculty on it, because around that time I was doing a lot of advocacy work with within my school district, and I was with this organization, and we were doing informational seminars. We were changing some of the administrative processes, like we changed and standardized the process for what to do if a kid comes out as trans or gender diverse. And we had specific designated people at each school and specific processes to do depending on the child's age and their safety at home. Like, it was a whole thing, and I was really proud of the work I was doing there. But that was all outside of classes. None of what I learned in my classes were at all related to being queer or trans or anything.
Do you think it would have helped you in your teenage years had you had a more inclusive curriculum?
Probably. I can definitely say it would not have hurt. Especially given the fact that our biology classes definitely could have used some sort of addendum on the differentiation between gender and sex, if only to prove that Mormon guy in physics wrong. Like, on a larger scale, those classes are the only exposure people get to the sciences or the ideas behind human development, especially high school biology. And not including them means people think there is definitely only two sexes and gender is not a different thing. And therefore, all of this is made up baloney. And having some sort of baseline in high school classes would have been extremely helpful when it came to having those discussions with other people. If only because then I wouldn't be citing, research papers and they'd be like, okay, but well, the information that I have is completely different because it's from our textbook. And I'd be like, okay, but they're not the ones studying this. And it was a whole big thing because people don't like to be told they're wrong.
So while at FLC or ARC, have you had experiences being misgendered in the classroom?
Yeah. There was a specific instance of, it happened a lot more in my first year or two at ARC because, for one thing, we didn't have the pronouns and we didn't have the name change in Canvas and the e-services and all that. So it was very obvious anytime a student was trans. And for another, especially taking the general education classes and not being in the psychology classes, the professors there had very little literacy as to how to treat students with any sort of gender diversity and any sort of deviance in how they present themselves. And so I got misgendered quite a bit back then. And there was actually an instance where I almost ended up contributing to an official claim against one particular professor because he took it way too far on several accounts for several students.
Was this at ARC?
Yes. It was, I don't remember the professor's name, but the instance that I had with him was I was a bit too, I didn't quite understand the concept of tell us about yourself essays. And I was not informed they would be read to the front, to the class. And so I talked about being trans and being in sports, and particularly swim, and how alienating that was, and how the focus was constantly on my body. And instead of addressing, okay, well, maybe this is an essay I shouldn't read to the class, or okay, maybe this is something we can be, friendly about. He started talking about my breasts to the classroom.
What was the topic of the class?
It was English. We were doing just general English, and they were. Yep. And then in that same essay, I made the mistake of talking about past mental health issues, and one of the students who wasn't paying attention decided to call the campus police on me because they thought I was going to shoot up the school because I was mentally ill. So all in all, that class kind of sucked. But there was a lot of just complete non-awareness on how to treat any sort of topic like that. Like, the professor, that particular professor, spent a lot of time just being completely inappropriate and talking about sexual things anytime some sort of gender diversity came up. And there were a few other professors that weren't nearly as bad, but would definitely mess up pronouns and not really try too hard to fix them. So it's definitely been something I've experienced.
Has that affected how you feel in the classroom? Like how you feel about the professor, your sense of like inclusion and well-being in the classroom in general? Do you feel yourself, I guess my question is, do you feel yourself checking out at all in those situations?
Oh, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if I have like my rule book for social interaction, and when that happened, that first year in college, I had to completely change my rule book because I couldn't engage in a classroom where I felt like if I spoke up too much, the professor would then turn it around and become aggressive towards me or talk about sexual things when I was not talking about that at all. So I ended up just not engaging much at all in most of the English classes, not just his class, but most of the English classes that I had to take, because I didn't trust either myself or them not to repeat that kind of experience. And so I, for the last several semesters, have been slowly working on more and more being able to connect with professors and talk about course-related things and all that, because for a long time I refused to talk one-on-one with a professor at all. And so I'm working on that, but especially at the time, it was very alienating. It kind of just took me out of, hey, you're a student, and placed me in a box that said, hey, you are an outcast, and if you talk about being an outcast, you will be singled out. And it was a very unhealthy environment to be in.
What have your experiences been trying to find bathrooms, all gender bathrooms, on campus, on FLC or ARC?
I have, for the most part, completely given up on that. I trust... I honestly think that at this point I have experienced enough that if someone tried to assault me for being in a bathroom, which is statistically kind of likely, no matter which one I go into, I will be able to handle it. But the difficulty of actually finding a safe bathroom and the stress of trying to get there and make sure it's empty and open and able to be used, because sometimes they're in very popular spaces. Like I think the one at ARC was behind the cafeteria where a lot of students were, so it was often used. Were just locked. They locked it for a while. All of that was too much for me to be able to accommodate that. So instead, I have kind of actively chosen to give up on that and to just place myself more in harm's way. Or if I'm feeling particularly like I don't think I can do that today, I'll just hold it. I just won't use the bathroom, which is not a healthy thing to do, but I'm not going to be able to do anything else. So, that was like a very big issue for a while there, is just finding a safe place to use the bathroom. And it still kind of is. I've got to figure out where they are at Sac State and if they're going to be able to be used a lot or not. So, yeah, no, that was one of the biggest issues with being trans, especially when I was cared more about how I was being perceived. And I probably should care more now that there's a larger rise in anti-trans sentiment, but like, come at me, bro. I'm just so tired.
So, is there anything you think faculty should know about sort of how they could make the classroom more inclusive in general? For you, right? Considering all of your identities, the fact that you're queer and trans, but also the fact that you're autistic. Is there anything you want to say about that?
Clear communication, being open to having more in-depth conversations about clarification, or being open to the idea that you might be wrong on a subject. That was a really big one. Is sometimes you're wrong, and that's okay. As far as being queer and trans goes, like, bringing up gender in the classroom at all is something that nowadays there isn't as much science behind it as there is bias. Because there are a number of different factors that can go into anyone's statistic. There are a number of different factors that can go into any one way a person develops or not. And so I think it would be really a lot better if people spent more time either doing research or just being aware that, hey, I might be wrong, but this is my current information. And as well, don't sexually harass your students. Like, that's, I don't know, I thought that was pretty self-explanatory, but if a student comes out to you as trans, don't talk about their body parts. So that's about.
So I have a lot of questions here, but maybe I'll just ask a very open-ended question. Is there anything else you'd like to add about your experiences being a community college student, especially with regard to being trans and queer, but also at the sort of intersection of your various identities? Very general, I realize.
It's very general. Get to know your DSBS office more, because there's a lot they can do and a lot they can't do, and I have seen so many times professors say, I can't give you that accommodation because of X, Y, or Z reason, when that's just not true. And just being aware of what you can and can't do for your students, and being aware of, hey, this student might not have official accommodations because it's kind of hard to get them. Maybe there's something I can do for the whole class that would help them specifically. Because there's been a few times where a professor has, my neuroanatomy teacher specifically, she had a few students in there who had trouble focusing and trouble keeping on track during the tests, and none of them had official accommodations. So she just gave us all more time because the rest of us are gonna, sit there bored a little bit more? Like, most of the students will finish well within the time, and we're allowed to leave early, so there's no detriment to giving us all extended time if some of us need it. So that was one of the coolest things that I've seen a professor do.
I guess as a final question, what makes you excited about being a college student and now a college student who's about to transfer to Sac State?
I love learning. Like, I cannot not learn. That's the only thing I've been doing consistently my entire life, and it is the only thing that I will continue to consistently do. And being a college student is a direct path to that, and it's a direct path to me enjoying just living and being alive and learning about all these different things that can happen or do happen or don't happen. Like trees. Trees can talk to each other. That's so crazy. That's amazing. And I wouldn't have learned it if I wasn't in college studying like nerves. So just having that sort of access to information and the ability to learn more is amazing to me. That's probably what I'm going to covet for the rest of my life. It's just access to information.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.